Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Death Penalty Focus webinar on the case for universal clemency in California. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Mary Kate DeLuco. I am a communications consultant at Death Penalty Focus, and I'm here with my colleague, Yoko Otani Sperlin, who's running everything behind the scenes. And before we start, I just wanted to let you know this webinar will be taped and will be available on demand on our website probably within a week. It's usually sooner than a week. And when it is available, we will send out an email letting everyone know with the link and if you are registered. And with saying that, I think that's all I have. And I'd like now to introduce you to our moderator, DPF Board President Mike Farrell. Mike.
Thank you very much. Mary Kate, we're happy to hear from all of you and know that you're with us, and glad that you could join us for this discussion featuring three people who are intimately involved with the effort to convince Governor Gavin Newsom to grant clemency to the 620 death sentenced people in California before he terms out of office. So I want to introduce them first. Robert Bacon, who's been representing death sentenced clients for more than 30 years and is actively involved in systemic work for criminal justice reform. Natasha Minsker, an attorney and a consultant who focuses on criminal justice and political advocacy. And Molly Sheahan, Associate Director for Healthy Families at the California Catholic Conference, who advocates in the state legislature on policies designed to support the most vulnerable members of society, including those sentenced to death. Thank you for being here, Bob and Natasha and Molly, and welcome to all of you, and thank you, everybody in and out of the room. I know how busy you are. I'm grateful you can take the time to discuss this issue, and I would have that if we were able to enact it, would have a historic impact on California's criminal justice system. Bob, let me start with you with a general question about the law on clemency, what power the governor has to commute sentences, what the limitations are on that power. How exactly would universal clemency work?
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Clemency is the power of an authority in the executive branch of government to reduce or set aside criminal penalties imposed by the courts. We're talking here about commutation, which reduces the person's sentence while they remain convicted of a crime. It also includes pardons, which eliminate criminal convictions entirely. It applies both to death penalty cases and other cases. Power that goes back many centuries, that was exercised by the British kings. And although the founders of this country did away with many of the trappings of the British monarchy, the clemency power was considered important enough that it was retained. The US Constitution gives the president the power of clemency over federal prisoners, and most, if not all, state constitutions give the governor power of clemency, either the governor or a parole board for state prisoners. There's a couple of justifications for clemency. One is that it's a fail-safe for the justice system to remedy injustices that the courts either can't or won't correct. Also can be used as an expression of mercy or grace unrelated to the facts of the crime or the trial. One example of this, a couple of years ago, the governor of Oregon used her clemency power to reduce the sentences of a group of prisoners who'd done very dangerous duty on the front line of fighting forest fires and providing a service to all the people of the state, and she rewarded them with a reduction in their sentence. Usually it's given one at a time based on the individual circumstances of particular prisoners, but in the example we're talking about today, as well as the one I've just mentioned, it's also available for a large group of similarly situated people all at once. You want me to go on and?
Oh, no, thank you. But give me
Okay.
a sense of it is in our Constitution, correct? So it's available. And what is the history of clemency in California? Has it been used recently? Is it something that is in use on a regular basis?
It is in use on a regular basis, but in non-capital cases, Governor Newsom quite regularly grants both commutations and pardons, and Governor Brown before him did. In capital cases, it was actually very common in the first half of the 20th century. It was often used then. Over that period, 15 or 20% of the death sentences in California were commuted to life sentences, even though during those decades, almost all the governors of California were very conservative Republicans. Governor Pat Brown, Jerry's father, commuted a large number of death sentences. Some of the others, governors, commuted very few. It has not been used recently in capital cases. The last governor to commute a death sentence in California was Governor Reagan, who did so in 1967. Governor Jerry Brown was asked repeatedly to commute death sentences. He never granted those requests, but he never denied them either. He just ignored them. But as I said a moment ago, Governor Newsom quite regularly grants clemency in non-capital cases. There's one very unusual wrinkle in the California Constitution. If the person has been twice convicted of a felony, that refers to two different occasions, two different trials, not just to two felonies at the same trial. But if the person has been twice convicted of the felony, the governor cannot grant clemency on his own, but must get approval of the majority of the California Supreme Court. This affects about 2/3 of the people who are now under death sentence in California. It's truly unique among the states. It goes back to the 19th century. It was a very odd remedy for a very legitimate problem. They were concerned about clemency grants to prisoners who had mutual friends with the governor, or even worse, to the use of bribery of the governor and his staff to get clemency. And the remedy they chose, the fail-safe, was a very odd one because it only applies to people with multiple felony convictions. It is out there. Governor Newsom fairly regularly asks the California Supreme Court for permission to grant clemency to people with multiple felony convictions. So far, the California Supreme Court has granted all of these requests. Governor Brown, Jerry Brown, made a number of these requests. The court granted most, but not all of those. Supreme Court doesn't give reasons when they rule on these requests from the governor, but they have said that they give the governor the benefit of the doubt, that they're asking whether the governor would abuse his power if he granted clemency to this particular person, that they're not deciding whether, if it was up to them alone, whether they would or wouldn't grant clemency. That's a very unusual wrinkle in California.
Gotcha. Well, that being the case, you said before, none of the requests by Newsom have been for people on death row. They've all been that have gone through this process.
That's right.
And now, in 1986, Tony Anaya granted universal clemency in New Mexico. Kate Brown did it in Oregon. There have been 8 governors around the country who've done this. Do you know what the reaction to that was in any of these states, or do you have any thoughts about the potential reaction here?
there was some amount of backlash in each of these states. By the way, at least 2 of those 8 governors were Republicans, in Illinois and in Arkansas. Supporters of the death penalty were very vocal that the governor had done a very bad thing that he shouldn't have done. But there's nothing they can do in the political process to rescind it. Some of these governors were near the end of their term, so that you can't even vote against them. Eventually, over time, people got used to it, and at least 3 of those states, within a few years, the death penalty was abolished completely. The governor set in motion a larger movement against the death penalty that happened in Illinois and New Mexico and in Massachusetts. What will happen in California? We know that in 1972, when the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, there was an immediate, very strong backlash led by Governor Reagan that resulted in an initiative constitutional amendment that allowed it to be brought back. In 2025 and 2026, there will be backlash, but I think we can say quite confidently both that there will be backlash, but a lot less than there was in 1972. We can say that for a number of reasons. There's simply less enthusiasm for the death penalty in California than there was 50 years ago. After 19 years without any executions, many Californians, if asked, would say we don't have the death penalty anymore. Those people won't miss it. Most Californians live in counties where the district attorney never asks juries to impose the death penalty. If the governor grants universal clemency, these prisoners will stay in the same prisons where they are now. You're not going to meet one of them in the checkout line at the supermarket. There are people who would miss the death penalty. They're loud, but they're loud out of proportion to their numbers. Their numbers are declining. One other thing that occurred to me, fewer and fewer states use the death penalty, and they tend to be states with which California has less and less in common. And people criticizing the Governor Newsom for imposing universal clemency, their message would sound like, Governor Newsom won't let California be like Alabama. He won't let us be like Oklahoma. That doesn't sound like a message that's going to get a lot of traction in California politics in this decade. So there is reason for hope that the backlash will not be severe, will not last a long time, and folks will get over it.
Well, that's interesting. Molly, that brings to mind ideas of mercy and redemption and how those are reflected in your faith. Do you think people of faith will support universal clemency on the basis that it's an act of mercy?
I think so, Mike. I think that the concept of mercy is really critical for us to understand, that we have a duty to protect life. The U.S. bishops have been very clear. Pope Francis talked to Governor Newsom when he visited the Vatican back in May, and he urged him at that time to end the death penalty in our state and to grant universal clemency. So our California bishops are echoing that call because, we don't heal ourselves by taking the lives of others. We have a responsibility to respect human life as sacred, and every single one of us has human dignity. None of us is the worst thing that we have done, and that dignity is a gift from God. It's not something that's earned or lost through our behavior. So this opportunity to promote universal clemency, I think people can really understand that it creates that balance of justice and mercy. You're protecting the vulnerable, and you're also recognizing that, and removing the death penalty as an option gives people the opportunity to repent. Those who have offended, to repent, to transform their lives, to repair the harm that they've done. Pope Francis has talked about this concept of a throwaway culture, a culture of violence, that our society really embraces violence as a way of responding to challenges. And we need to transform our own hearts and change our point of view to say that we are able to protect society, to protect public safety without using the death penalty as an option, that we need to end it because it's inhumane. And reject this culture of violence and know that we don't heal ourselves by taking the lives of others.
Thank you. Well, Bob, to go back, universal clemency and abolition don't necessarily go hand in hand, right? I mean, governors can grant universal clemency, but they don't have the authority to abolish the death penalty, or do they? At least in their state. So if Newsom were to grant clemency, the next governor is under no obligation to do so, and we'd still have the death penalty, and the death sentences would pile up again, and that's a continuing problem, isn't that right? Bob, I'm sorry, Bob, that was directed to you.
Here I am. Yes. The good news is that the death sentences wouldn't pile up very fast.
Right.
In 2022, there were 2 new death sentences in this state. Last year, there were 4. This year, at most, there will be 4, and maybe fewer than that. Very few county DAs around California ever ask juries to impose the death penalty anymore. And even fewer would waste public money on asking for the death penalty if they knew that the governor was going to or even likely to commute the death sentences. So yes, death sentencing would go on, but it has been in decline for decades, and a grant of universal clemency would only speed up that decline.
Okay. Natasha, help me explain the concept of universal clemency. Of the 620 death sentence people in our prisons, how many are eligible for clemency? And if granted, does it mean everyone would be resentenced to life without parole?
Mike, if we persuade Governor Newsom to move forward with universal clemency, then every single death sentence in California would be changed, and most likely changed initially to a sentence of life without parole. So taking a step back to answer your question, what is universal clemency? As Bob Bacon said, it is the use of the clemency power by the governor, the executive, based on a category or systemic issues, not individual factors. So the difference here is we're not asking the governor to read 620 files and evaluate each individual on death row based on individual factors and whether they are worthy or not worthy of mercy. We are saying to the governor, we believe every human being has human dignity, and we believe the death penalty is an affront to human dignity, and that every person should have mercy and should have their death sentence changed. And so it's approaching the issue from the perspective of not the individual factors in the case. Was this person subject to abuse? Was there racism in their trial? It's approaching the issue from the flaws that are inherent in the death penalty and apply to every case. Because we know that the death penalty in California and this country is racist. We know that in California, people who are Black, Latino, Native American are disproportionately sentenced to death. We know that our death penalty is infected with racism from beginning to the end. And we know that the death penalty is an affront to human dignity in every case. We know if you looked at each case individually, one by one, we know that you would have histories of trauma and mental illness in every single case. No one ends up on death row unless they have themselves been experienced trauma and have mental illness and are struggling with disabilities and issues like this. So we know that the death penalty is flawed from the very roots, and that we must end the death penalty in California, this country, and the world. And that is what we are asking the governor to recognize through universal clemency, to say, this isn't about the individual facts of this case or this person. This is about what's wrong with the death penalty. And as Bob Bacon said, in California, we have this wrinkle that for some of the cases, the California Supreme Court must also weigh in. So about a third of the people sentenced to death right now Governor Newsom has full authority to change their sentence by himself. And for about 2/3, he will need to present the case to the California Supreme Court. And our advocacy, our ask, is that he go to the Supreme Court and say, I am asking you to recognize my authority to change all of these sentences and get rid of all of these death sentences, because I, as the governor, can choose mercy and have the ability to choose life over death always. And you need to recognize my authority to do that. As Bob said, we have this wrinkle in our Constitution to prevent against abuse of power. This is the opposite. This is the governor acting in accordance with the very basis of the idea of clemency, that a governor, that the executive can always choose mercy. And that means fundamentally choosing life over death. Now, what happens in the case of universal clemency? Because it's not an individual review, the governor is not going to go through and say, well, I think this person should have life without parole, and this person should have a life sentence, and this person should have some other sentence, and I think this person is innocent. That's not what happens with universal clemency. The governor would just get rid of all the death sentences, and they would convert then to the next lowest sentence, which is life without possibility of parole. But what's critical to understand and remember is that it would not be the end of the road for folks, that they would still have the option of coming back to the governor and requesting an individual review. And they would still have the option of going back to court and requesting resentencing or continuing to litigate the issues in their case. So I do want to be clear that our goal here in this universal clemency campaign is to get rid of all death sentences, but we are not trying to simply convert all of these sentences to life without parole and stop there. We are trying to get rid of these death sentences and move us forward so that we can then start addressing the circumstances that each individual finds them in. And we want to do this campaign and our work in a way that preserves the ability of individuals to address the issues in their case, to fight for their innocence, to address continuing unfairness in their case and racial bias in their case. And ultimately, we work against the death penalty because we believe the death penalty is wrong, is racist, and an affront to human dignity. And we do our work in a way that puts forth values of nonviolence. And we are not seeking to reinforce other extreme sentences like life without parole. We are seeking to make our criminal justice system more just and to recognize the value of every individual life.
Wow. I hope he puts it as well to them as you did to us. Well, where are we in the process? Has the question been put to Newsom already? And are we?
Great question. Great question. So people might think, wow, these folks are coming up with this out of nowhere. We are not coming up with this out of nowhere. Governor Newsom has publicly said that this is something he thinks about. You know, from the day he became governor, the death penalty is something that has weighed on him and weighed in his heart. And he, every single week, is reviewing petitions for clemency and pardon, as Bob Bacon says, not in death penalty cases, but in other cases. But this is not an abstract concept for the governor. The fact that he is the ultimate decider on the death penalty is very real for him, and he feels it in his bones. And also, he is regularly engaging in the act of reviewing cases and that act of clemency. It's a very real part of what it means to be governor. And this is why when he became governor, one of the first things he did was put the moratorium in place on March 13th, 2019, just a couple of months into his time being governor, because he said as soon as he was sworn in, the idea that someone's life would be in his hands, he could not, in his heart, move forward with an execution. And he needed to know that that protection of the moratorium would be in place and that he would not be faced without warning with that power he did not think he should have, that he just did not think was real. And so the governor has said, yes, he thinks about universal clemency for people sentenced to death. It is something he considers. And as Molly said, it's something that the Pope has asked him to do. So this is a very real conversation for the governor, especially as he gets close to the end of his term. He has 2 more years left, and he is at that point where questions of legacy and what impact and what change he wants to make in California weigh very heavily with him. To be clear, he doesn't talk to me. This is what he says in the press. These are very public comments, just to be clear.
Well, thank you for that. But if he talked to you, he would have his hair standing on end, and he would be acting immediately, it seems to me. So the campaign then, such as it is looking for support. There's no date to begin. We're all in the process at this point. Is that correct?
That is correct. We do have a website. I'll see if I don't know if I can put it in the chat here for everyone, but I'm going to try. So our website is very simple, clemencyca.org. And this is where everyone can go and sign our petition and join on to the campaign and make your voice part of the campaign for universal clemency. We don't have a date to bring our petition to the governor. Our goal is to ask the governor to move forward with universal clemency in 2025, which is next year. So we are at the stage now of building our support. I hope each one of you will join add your individual name, add your organizations, add your congregations, go to your faith leader and ask them to sign on. And we are building out our support and going to organizations that have supported ending the death penalty and have not. So unions, when we have done our ballot initiative campaigns here in California, we've had great support from unions who have actively supported ending the death penalty. So we are asking them to join this campaign. Faith communities, Molly spoke from the perspective of the Catholic Conference. Ben the R, which is a Jewish faith organization, is also one of the leaders of our campaign. And bringing in every faith voice that we can is very important. It's very important because faith communities have been at the forefront of the work to end the death penalty for centuries, and also because it is part of Governor Newsom's approach to this issue. He is very motivated by his faith. And so we want everyone to join our campaign, sign up through our website on the petition, and as the campaign builds steam, we will have more opportunities for people to get involved. We also have an event coming up on December 8th in San Francisco. I'll find the RSVP for that and share that also, but it will be our first in-person event that is being hosted with the UN Association in San Francisco to recognize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a declaration against torture. Everyone has a right not to live free of torture. And from the UN's perspective, the death penalty is torture. And so we're having our first event in San Francisco in partnership with the UN Association to bring folks together and get folks engaged as we move into a much more active phase of our campaign.
Very impressive. Let me just ask a technical question. What about those who on death row who maintain their innocence? Would they be able to continue to pursue appeals? Would all of them lose their lawyers or access to lawyers?
Great question, Mike. And this is something that our coalition has been very concerned about. And we were actually able to get a change through the legislature to make sure that one of our state agencies that represents people sentenced to death, the Habeas Corpus Resource Center. Previously, the statute that created that center said they could only represent people sentenced to death. We were able to get that changed so that they will now be able to represent people sentenced to life without parole who had previously been sentenced to death. And so that was a very important step we were able to take to ensure that there will still be access to counsel after universal clemency. No one will lose their ongoing litigation related to innocence, and no one should lose their attorney because of a grant of mercy by the governor. And this will mean that also that all of our work continues, right? We're not going to succeed with universal clemency and then I'll retire and go home. Our work continues For every individual who is now under sentence of death, we continue to fight for those who are innocent and continue to fight to address the racism in the system and every injustice in the system. We will have more work to do.
Indeed. To speak to that, there are prosecutors today here in California pursuing the death sentences. If Newsom grants executive clemency, would those cases be affected, or would they be played out? And then, as Bob suggested, we'd have to start over again with a new population of death sentenced people?
Yes, that is one of the ongoing problems we have in California, that a small number of district attorneys, specifically Sacramento, Riverside, and San Bernardino, those are our three problematic counties that continue to sentence people to death. There are 58 counties in California, and that means 55 of them have not sentenced anyone to death in several years. So we have 3 counties that are actively a problem. And so part of our job is to focus on those district attorneys, to raise our voices in Sacramento, Riverside, and San Bernardino, and say, this is not consistent with our values, and advocate for those district attorneys to change their mind, as we have successfully done with other district attorneys, right? So I want to bring the example of Santa Clara District Attorney Jeff Rosen. He used to believe in the death penalty. He's a line prosecutor for 30 or more years, and he was actively involved in death penalty cases. And through advocacy and education, and critically through a trip he took to Alabama to the National Legacy Sites, where he was educated about the history of racism in this country and learned that the death penalty is rooted in the history of slavery in America. That experience and years of advocacy persuaded District Attorney Jeff Rosen that he no longer supports the death penalty. He stopped pursuing death sentences, and he is now asking the courts to resentence everyone who had been sentenced to death in his county. So that's what we as advocates and community members can achieve with the other district attorneys who we have not reached yet.
Isn't that great? That's Brian Stevenson's work continues.
Absolutely.
Molly, how do you see the church actively involved in this campaign? Are there faith groups that you've aligned with that share your stance? Is there common ground available?
Yeah, there is a lot of common ground with a number of folks from the faith community. So obviously, I represent the Catholic community, but we're working with Natasha mentioned some of the Jewish groups, including Bend the Ark, a number of various Christian traditions, the Friends Committee on Legislation, which is the Quakers, and a lot of other faith traditions have a strong commitment to nonviolence, which really helps to inform this opposition to the death penalty and this push for universal clemency. We're seeing our churches really encourage this, especially during this month, which is Respect Life Month. We're seeing the Jewish community talk about this, especially around the high holy days this month. October 10th was World Day Against the Death Penalty. And we're continuing to see presentations in our schools, in our colleges. Bishop Cantu just did some outreach to Jeff Rosen, who Natasha was talking about, to thank him for his opposition to the death penalty. Archbishop Cordileone in San Francisco has continued to be very outspoken that this is a life issue, and this is something that we need to see changed in California, to have this universal clemency. So we're hoping to continue to ramp that up and push for this. Just encouraging all of those who ascribe to a religious faith that by reason we know that the death penalty is inhumane, and our faith impels us to speak out in opposition to that, to advocate, to bring that mercy forward and into our state and into our society.
That's the Pope has recently announced, or this is, I guess, in fact, a Jubilee year, as it's called, every 25 years. And Pope Francis announced it. He said the theme will be Pilgrims of Hope, a year of hope in the world. How does a Jubilee year fit in with the campaign for universal clemency?
I mean, what a gift, right? The opportunity to remind us of the gift of hope. The 2025, it's a Jubilee year, which builds on the biblical concept of Jubilee, recognizing the freedom that God has given us. Christian hope is a confident expectation that God keeps his promises. God has been generous with every one of us. He's poured out mercy and compassion on every one of us. And so we have a duty to imitate him. This Jubilee Year of Mercy that starts in 2025. It's a moment where we can renew our commitment to mercy, to transforming ourselves, to building a society of hope. And so we'll continue to see this in the way that, for Catholics, we do prison ministry and continue to advocate for restorative justice, to bring that hope. And also it's a chance to advocate for universal clemency, and to say that at this time when we remember the mercy that God has given us, it's an opportunity to say, let's bring universal clemency to the 620 people on death row, and really to embrace that moment in time.
Well, I have to say, as someone who's been involved in this issue for a while, this is really exciting. It's really the idea of what all of this work together can create in our society. It moves me deeply. Mary Kate or Yoko, do we have questions from any of our listeners?
Can you hear me, Mike?
Yes.
Great. Yes, we do. We have several questions. One is from the Georgians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And GFADP is asking, has any Southern state attempted and or achieved universal clemency? Has any state that grants clemency through a parole board ever granted universal clemency?
I'll start, but I hope Bob will jump in and say, well, first, thank you to our friends in Georgia for the work you do. We are lucky to be in California, and you are really at the front line. So thank you for being here and for everything you're doing. Unfortunately, I don't know of a Southern state where a governor has granted universal clemency yet. There is an active campaign going on in North Carolina. They're very public about their campaign urging the North Carolina governor to grant universal clemency there. The North Carolina governor will term out in just a couple of months. So I definitely urge people to support the work going on in North Carolina. And I don't know of any situation where a parole board has acted in a universal way. To be clear, we've talked mostly about universal death sentencing or clemency in universal death penalty cases. As Bob mentioned, universal clemency has also been processed or something that governors have done for other issues. For example, I believe it was the Illinois governor granted universal clemency to people on parole in order to restore their voting rights. So there may be examples from Southern states that I'm not aware of, but none that I know of that specifically relate to the death penalty. Bob, let me know if I'm wrong on that.
You are correct in the lifetime of most of the people listening to us, but in a different era, in 1970, give or take a year, the first ever Republican governor of Arkansas since Reconstruction did commute all the death sentences. He was a very different kind of Republican than the woman who serves in that position today.
I would say. Okay. Any other questions, Mary Kate?
Yes, I have. I thought. Hold on here. We have a question about, and I think Bob may have addressed this. How will universal clemency affect the movement to end LWOP?
It will free up a great deal of resources to devote to the movement to amend LWOP. We waste tens of millions of dollars on death penalty litigation with no net gain to public safety. Hundreds of the best and the brightest devote themselves to working against the death penalty, and those resources will be freed up for a great many of other causes, one of which is the campaign to reduce or eliminate the use of life without parole.
Well put.
Yes, thank you, Bob. Tangentially related question. Are there any commutation petitions from capital cases pending before Governor Newsom? Is there any likelihood that he would grant individual ones?
I believe there are only a handful that are currently pending. Most of the focus has been on the universal approach. And I do think I do not know the answer to the question of whether the governor would consider individual petitions rather than the universal approach. I think our view from that of advocates is that we are pushing for universal, and we're going to keep pushing for that approach until we are told, no, that's off the table. And then we would pivot to the question of how many individual grants we could persuade the governor to pursue. But our goal is to leave no one behind.
I have another one here for you. What is the political case for universal clemency from Newsom's point of view? Why risk the public opinion backlash, especially if Newsom might seek higher office? Aren't there future governors likely to continue the moratorium?
I really like this question. It's very nuanced. So thank you for asking. First, I'll go in reverse order. What will future governors do? It's a free-for-all in the race for governor right now in California. I'm not running, but it seems like everybody else is. There are many candidates for governor who have already pledged to continue the moratorium. There are others that would not. And so it is not a given that the next governor in California will continue the moratorium. That is definitely something that is of consideration to Newsom. It's also true that Governor Newsom is very committed to this issue, and he is a person of principle. And I believe personally that his political brand and his identity is very much rooted in being a person of principle. He stood up for the right to marriage equality when it was not popular, and it was something that he at the time took heat for, but it was what he believed, and he continued that position. Similarly, on the death penalty, he has been very public in how strongly he opposes the death penalty, and it would almost be inconsistent with his core values for him to leave office without acting in the way that he could to grant mercy to people sentenced to death. And so I believe the political case is that he is a person of integrity and deeply held values, and the voters respect elected officials who follow their deeply held values and their beliefs. And it is also the case that here in California, we have polling that actually shows the majority of California voters would strongly support the governor if he were to grant universal clemency. I don't know if that's going to win him over with the voters of Alabama, but we know it is consistent with his values and with California values. And I believe that he can make a very strong case to the voters that they want someone of integrity and someone who follows through on their beliefs.
Well, and do we have no more questions, right, MK?
Yes. And Molly, I believe you want to answer this. Am I correct? Will opponents say the governor would be circumventing the will of the people who are the only ones who can repeal the death penalty?
I think that's a question for Natasha or for Bob.
Oh, okay. For some reason it popped up. Molly's going to answer this, so I thought I'll let Molly answer it. Natasha.
It goes back to the history lesson that Bob Bacon gave us, right? That the power of mercy is something that the people of California baked into our Constitution. We have had it in place since the very beginning and founding of this state, and it is a value we cherish. And we believe that the governor should have the power to right a wrong and fight for and stand for against injustice and stand for justice. And it is consistent with the will of the voters as they have voted over and over again. They voted into office Governor Newsom knowing that he strongly opposed the death penalty. In fact, Governor Newsom was the first statewide elected official to endorse the initiative to repeal the death penalty when he was lieutenant governor in 2012. And so the will of the voters was to choose a governor who has been absolutely clear with them that he opposes the death penalty and that is a deeply held value of his. And the voters have always supported the right or the power of the governor to choose mercy and grant clemency. And this is consistent with the will of the voters for their governor to act on his values.
Molly, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I could just add that, he also showed his values by dismantling the death chamber, and really showed that by putting that moratorium in place as one of his first acts as governor. So by doing so, really showing that he wants to see a transformation in the death penalty. And so asking him for universal clemency is a great opportunity to encourage him and bolster that view that he already has, that the death penalty can be ended. So by everyone who's listening to signing on to that campaign, supporting at clemencyca.org, we have the opportunity to give him that support to say, yes, this is a critical issue for Californians. We want to see the death penalty removed. We want to see universal clemency. And so by encouraging him, we're giving him that support to say, yes, this is what Californians want to see have happen.
Thank you. I just want to underscore your point that the example he set by not only declaring the death penalty would not go forward in the state under his authority, but also by dismantling the death penalty, the death chamber itself, was, I think, a quite dramatic and very important statement. Absent any more questions, I simply want to say how impressed I am and thank you for the three of you for your learned and very articulate answers to these questions. And hopefully we've reached a number of people out there who can pass on the word. Thank you on behalf of Death Penalty Focus and all people who care about other people.
Thank you, Mike. We are devoted
Thank you, Mike,
fans.
for all you do.
Absolutely.
That was wonderful. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.